Hello, everyone. Welcome to Into the Terminal. Today, we're going to continue our services on Linux, StoryArc. And Nate is going to jump into the terminal and take us through installing and configuring a website and web server on Linux.
Yeah. I got to tell you, the number of times I've had to set up a web server in my career is pretty high. All right. So the first thing we got to do, of course, is install the packages for Apache's HTTPD and PHP, because the site that we're going to test this with is technically PHP based. So if you don't install the PHP modules, then Apache won't serve it. It'll just be like, I don't know what a PHP file is. It's just here, you can download it from me. So that's a thing to keep in mind if you have dependencies for your web application. So I'll clear the screen so you guys can see what I'm doing. Now we're going to go, Apache keeps its document root by default, and we'll go into that in the configuration a little bit later to show you like kind of where that is and how it's set in var www html. Working around enough web developers, you start calling www. Sorry, I don't know. Anyway, so now we're going to take in that directory. If you look in my home directory, there's this zip file for this totally businessy website. Okay, and we're just going to unzip it right inside of this directory. And here we go, right? You can see there's the PHP stuff. There's some CSS in there. And then in my testing, I have found that this hasn't been necessary, but you're going to want to make sure that things like ownership is correct and SE Linux contexts are correct. So if you don't follow the exact path that I just did, you may end up with wrong ownerships and whatnot. So for good measure, we're going to chown-r, which is recursive, Apache dot. So this whole subdirectory structure gets assigned to Apache. Now, there are certain use cases where you're going to want to also change around the permissions so that maybe Apache can't write to this directory structure, because there's some applications, especially PHP and dynamic ones, that you don't want them to be able to change anything that's in here, right? So those are things you're going to want to think about. For the sake of simplicity, we're just going to do it this way.
And,
okay, and then, of course,
I'd like to point out real quick, the reason that we're changing to Apache user and Apache group is because that is the user and group that the Apache daemons on our machine are running as. And so by
correct.
making the files owned by this user and group, that means that we're setting, who owns the files, what permissions apply to which users. So the owner of the file gets the first field of permissions, the group that owns the file gets the second field of permissions, and then everyone else is going to be under the third field of permissions.
Right. And then, of course, like I said, RestoreCon, we're just going to make sure that the SE Linux contexts have been applied here. This is pretty straightforward stuff. We've covered this kind of thing a million times on Into the Terminal. But now we should have the actual website in place. And really, all that should be left is to start up the services. So systemctl, enable, now HTTPD. And boom, it should not just say, yes, turn this thing on at boot, but it should start up the service. And then at this point, I need to switch tabs here. So give me just a moment.
And we, after starting it, we could have done a systemctl status, and that would have showed us that it's actually running and the daemon pool that's been started up for it.
Yes, yeah, we could certainly have done a status. Now, here's the website. Here it is up and running. So you can't see it on the screen here because of the way the share is working, but in the URL, I have the URL that points me to the lab machine that I'm working with. And here we go. Here's our awesome businessy website. So it's just that simple. So businessy.
So businessy.
If you have the website that you're already ready to put in place, it really is this simple. Now it gets more complicated when you get more dynamic and more complicated websites, right? But this is at its base how easy it is.
Right on.
All right, so that's our critical path. Any questions?
We will cover questions after transition.
Good point.
We'll also cover after the transition some dynamic content. We're also going to take a look at, excuse me, at pulling in code from GitHub directly into our web server content tree. Don't forget to like and subscribe. So, like it if you enjoy this content and want us to make more. Subscribe if you want to be notified when we're doing live streams or when we've posted new videos. We'll check you after the transition.
There we go.
Wow, producer Eric would be so proud of us, Nate. We like got through it in 5 minutes.
What? I can go back and take longer if you want.
Um, so now is the time in the program where you can ask us questions in the chat and we'll answer them to the best of our ability. If you're a deferred viewer, we do monitor and respond to comments. So put a comment in there and we'll get an answer back to you.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. We love to hear back from folks, and we love to, well, help people along.
So we've now got our static website content, right? That we had a web developer make for us, and they sent us a zip archive of their work, and then we just like put it in place and started serving it out. What other types of content might we see in Apache?
So Apache is actually pretty versatile. You can serve anything from static HTML to dynamic stuff like Perl, Python, and PHP. There's probably lots of other languages. It all depends on what modules and plugins and whatnot you throw into Apache. Apache is also really powerful with like it's not one site per server. There was a day when that was kind of the norm, but as web servers got more and more powerful, it got more and more common that you'd use what's called virtual hosts to serve several websites off of the same machine. And when I worked back in the web hosting industry, we would have single machines running probably dozens, if not hundreds of sites, right? So, yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about virtual hosts in a little bit. But yeah, Apache's really powerful. And there's other, other web server applications out there that are included with RHEL, such as Nginx, but we're not touching on that today.
Yeah, and Nginx has much the same capabilities. Plus, it can do
Yeah.
things like reverse proxy and a few other things. But like for the basic web server functionality, it works in much the same way. And we haven't
Yeah.
gotten into the configuration files yet, but it's going to have similar configuration options too.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe we'll do a future show on Nginx. I've also got plenty of plenty of experience with that. Eric probably cringed when I said Nginx because I said it so many times. I know Eric and Nginx don't get along very well. So speaking of configuration, I thought we would just walk through some of where the config files are stored and what you might find in there without taking kind of too much time, but just to give you some familiarity with where this stuff is. As you'd expect, the configuration for Apache is inside of etc HTTPD, right? Because a lot of people think Apache is the name of the web service. It isn't. It's HTTPD. Apache actually makes other things too. So HTTPD is a project that's from Apache, right? So just kind of think of it that way. But if someone says Apache, they probably mean HTTPD. Just saying. Tomcat, for example, there's an Apache Tomcat, right? It's another kind of web hosting thing for Java applications. But anyway, I digress. So here we are in etc HTTPD. You can see a directory structure here. The things we're going to look at first, or I should say really the things I'm going to focus on here are the conf directory and the conf.d directory. Now, these other things, there's things like symlinks to modules and the run and state directories. We're not going to touch on those. The conf modules D, that's a place where you can plug in different configuration for modules like PHP, for example, I think would live in there. There's different features of HTTPD that you can turn off and on. They'll go in modules D, but again, we're not going to go too deep in that. Conf is where you'll find the main Apache httpd.conf file, right? We're going to kind of look at, well, the other thing is conf.d. And as you might expect, if you're familiar with how these .d directories inside of most configuration for most services work, These are modular config files that will also be read in along with the main config. So the main config gets read first, and then these will get read in afterward. And you can override things that are in the main config with things that are in the confd directory, right? So just kind of keep that in mind. If you have the same directive in two places, it's really going to depend on when the service read it when it started up, right? So some people will even take these and number them so they know what order they're starting in because they're generally alphanumerically ordered, right? So in this case, you can see we've got a PHP conf that was put here when we installed PHP. We've got an SSL conf. That's like the main SSL configuration or TLS configuration for HTTPD. And there's some other things in here. But like I said, first we're going to look around at the httpd.conf inside of the main conf directory. This is why we're supposed to copy and paste these things. There we go. So this is a pretty big file. You can see at the bottom of my editor here, it's 358 lines. I talked earlier about that document root. I thought that would be a great example of what you might look for or what you might want to change, or at least an example of how things are configured within Apache. So let's look for document root. You can see there's a directive here that just says document root var www.html. So if for some reason I wanted my website to live somewhere else, I would just set that document root to something else. And when we talk about virtual hosts, you'll see that each virtual host can have its own document root. So, but again, we're going to touch on that in a little bit. There's also things in here for like directories specifically, what sort of access controls you want to put in place for them, whether you want them to allow executables or not. Whether you like what types of files, whether you can put a configuration override in there. There's all kinds of things. This is really, there's a ton you can configure in here. There's performance changes you can make in here. We don't have time in today's show to go through all of that. Logging, that's another important one to think about. I don't really touch on that too much today, but you can separate your virtual hosts out into separate logs, which is really helpful for trying to identify problems, especially if they're specific to a given site. But yeah, so anything you're curious about in the config file here, Scott, before I exit?
Well, I did have one thing. So one of the most annoying things that I found over my history of configuring web servers is making sure that you account for people coming to your site with www dot your domain name
Yeah.
or just
Yep.
your domain name.
Yep.
And so when you do things like virtual hosts, you actually often have to specify both flavors of um, that server name so that
Yep.
they can find it places.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit when I set up the virtual host. I don't have that called out in the virtual host, but we can certainly show you where that would be set up.
Super annoying. Oh, and the other thing is, some browsers do things differently. Like I think Internet Explorer used to actually prepend www onto things that you didn't put www onto. And
Yep.
so there were situations where like you would get www.your domain. So you have to kind of, you'll find that out. You'll see errors in the logs and you'll be like, what? Is somebody asking for that? And then you'll have to like add it in and account
Yeah,
for it.
and today web browsers seem notorious for assuming HTTPS instead of HTTP. I see that a lot where it automatically redirects to HTTPS, and that's really frustrating sometimes, especially when we're doing things like demos. Now, obviously, for a normal website, you probably want HTTPS anyway. That's kind of the standard anymore, and that's probably why it's like that. But yeah, sometimes it's frustrating when we're doing things like this where we don't have HTTPS set up.
Yeah. And Aaron Kolb was asking, what does CNAME fix these kind of naming issues? Um, so,
So yes and
in-
no. Yeah, right. So well, I mean, we can dive into the name-based virtual hosts if you want, but that's essentially what this is going to get into. When when you make a name-based virtual host, which is what I'm going to show in a second, it's 100% based on what DNS name you've put in your browser, right? So if in the browser I typed www.example.com, even if that CNAMEs to example.com or it CNAMEs to some other host entirely, webserver.example.com, what the browser passes to HTTPD is what's in the URL bar, right? So it doesn't matter if I've CNAMEd it elsewhere. Apache will still get the host name I've typed in the URL bar.
And I think DNS and web server work hand in hand.
They do.
DNS makes sure that when somebody types it into their browser, that traffic goes to the server that you want, right? Whether that be a CNAME record or an address record, DNS handles getting the traffic to the server you want. But once that traffic is there, then it's going to go through the HTTPD configuration to decide, especially if you're in virtual host land, which of the definitions of websites that live on that host it should serve back to that request. And there's actually one that can be tagged as the default. So if we get through all the list and none of them match, it'll serve back one that you've tagged as the default for the server.
Right. And if you haven't tagged a default, it'll use whatever the default in the httpd.conf, the var HTML is, which might be like the RHEL welcome page, right? You probably don't want that to display to your users if they come across this situation where the virtual host wasn't defined right, or the name got them there but it didn't resolve properly, that kind of thing. So just more stuff to keep in mind. All right. So name-based virtual hosts. Like I said, so let's hop into, let's see, let's go to var www. We're going to clone in another web tree. And if you're familiar with any of Scott's demos, you've probably seen this one before. We're going to go grab the good old clumsy bird because it's a little Java app, right? Now, I Git cloned it right into var www. Now, if you're familiar with Git, you know that makes a subdirectory for the name of the Git repo. So now I've got, instead of var www HTML and just cgi-bin, which is something else we're going to talk about in a little bit, we've also got this clumsy bird directory. Now, that's outside of var www HTML, so this cannot be served by our current HTTPD configuration. We're going to go to conf.d.
And Nate, I did just want to make a comment about what we were talking about before the show about Git cloning. So this is a way of doing website management, right? Of like storing all your website content in Git. Because now if the developer pushes an update, how would you ingest that update as the web server administrator?
Right. Yep. Yeah, exactly. So if there's a new update in Git, I could even have something maybe that automatically pulls on the web server that just does a Git pull every so often. Or maybe I schedule a maintenance window, and now to update that web tree, all I'm doing is a Git pull. So if the Git repository is set up in such a way that the doc root of the application is also the root of the Git repository, you can absolutely do it this way. The other way would be to pull it to some other location and copy in the things that you need, which is also valid, right? You can still script that. You can still make that the way that you do things, but entirely up to how you would administer your machines and how your developers want to work. All right, so I made a new config file inside of conf.d called itt.conf. And you can see here, we have a virtual host directive. It's listening on port 80 because I didn't want to take the time to get SSL working or TLS working, but you absolutely could do that. You basically just have another block that says virtual host *:443, but you have to make sure you include in there definitions for whatever certificate it's going to serve along with that. I just didn't want to get into that today, but keep in mind that is a thing that you can do. Otherwise, if I go to this host that I'm defining on port 443, it's going to go to whatever the default virtual host that serves 443 is. And that would be like the RHEL welcome page right now. Or I guess, no, it won't be the RHEL welcome page. It'll be the realtor host page that we just set up. So just keep that in mind too, because that can get confusing. You can also define custom log files right inside of the virtual host, something else I didn't do here, but you can have it separate from the normal Apache log file so that you can tell what's going on with this specific virtual host instead of the whole of the HTTPD service, right? So just another thing, great for organizational purposes. All right, and then server name, this is what, oh, sorry, document root, that of course points to Clumsy Bird, where we clone that to. And then the server name, which is what Scott was talking about earlier, we can define what name we want this particular host to respond on. Now, you can do this by IP address. That would not be a name-based virtual host. That'd be an IP-based virtual host. Most commonly, I've seen them done this way, by name. This way, you can take the same IP address, the same server, and just say, okay, these different names respond with different sites, right? And this doesn't all have to be the same, even top-level domain name that your server normally responds on. In the case of that web hosting situation that I had, we had dozens of domains that we were hosting for people. They were all different all across the board, and they were all hosted on the same machine. You just have to make sure DNS gets them to the right place. And as Scott mentioned, you can have several server names for a single virtual host. So I could add another one that just said example.com. And then if someone went to example.com and it resolved them to this server, it would serve this page too. Now, I don't have anything that complicated set up in DNS. And in fact, I'm using a host sentry to make this work because, as you might imagine, I don't own example.com. So I can't make DNS for this work. But this is another great example of how what's in your browser URL bar is what matters. It doesn't necessarily matter what's in DNS. A host file is a great way to test out your site if you're like working on migrating it to a new host. You set up your host file to point to the IP of the new host. As long as the name that's in your address bar resolves through your host file and gets you to the right server, boom, you've got the right virtual host. So
while you're finishing that up, Frank Agerholm made a great point about get clones directly into your document root. That would include the .git directory, which might have things that you don't intend for people to get.
Yes.
So, but an excellent point.
So that's your ownership could fix that, right? You could be careful with how you have files owned and whatnot, but then you have to fix that every time you do a clone. So yes, that's a very good point. If you don't want that repository data inside of your web directory, web accessible directory, then be careful of that. Okay. So at this point, we should be ready, I think, to reload Apache. So if we do a systemctl reload, in fact, there's another cool thing you can do. There's a thing called Apache CTL.
Oh no.
Which is, you don't like Apache CTL? Apache CTL is how you used to control the HTTP daemon, right? Before we had initd, before we had systemd serving this, right? But what I like to still use it for is just a config test. And this may already be built into systemd. I've never looked, to be honest, because this is my muscle memory. This is how I test the config of Apache. But you can see it says it can't verify my FQDN, which is fine because DNS doesn't actually point things properly here. But it says that my syntax is okay. That's that last line there, which is great because that means that the stuff I put inside of that virtual host checks out because it reads that when it does this config test. Now we can feel confident that we can reload HTTP. Now that thing only checked syntax. If you have a configuration in there that matches the proper syntax but still doesn't work, you could either end up with a virtual host that doesn't work properly, or you could end up with Apache not restarting. And that's a situation you don't want to be in if you're doing this in the middle of the day. So be careful, right? Like this reload won't interrupt service unless you've made a typo in there that still passes the syntax check. So the number of times I've taken web hosts down in the middle of the day because of a typo, yeah, I prefer not to think about that.
Yeah.
All right, so
Apache, like super old, like before we had init and before we had systemd. That's how you would control Apache as Apache CTL.
Yeah.
So, man, blast from the past.
With initd, you could do a service HTTPD test or config test or something, and it would pass it to Apache CTL. I don't know if that ever got implemented with systemd. Someone in the chat, if you know, let me know. Maybe I can change my ways. Okay, so we should be able to actually see this website work now, as long as I didn't miss anything. So let me switch over to my other tab here. You're going to see Realtor Host for a minute, but that's kind of on purpose because it's the same tab I was using for that. we're going to go, you can't see my URL bar, but I promise you, I'm going to http://itt.example.com. And what should come up is our good old friend, Clumsy Bird. So, yeah, I can hear Clumsy.
See,
I tried this yesterday.
user error. I want you to pay attention. Eric. I'm not the only one that can't get first type on this game.
Is Eric better at Clumsy Bird?
He just mocks me for being terrible at it.
Maybe I can get past the first one. 53. Oh. All right, we're done with that. Let me stop Clumsy Bird so I can not hear the music in my head. All right, let me go back to my terminal share. How much time we got left? Yeah, we got time for cgi-bin. What do you think? Can we talk about cgi-bin?
Yeah, I think we should.
Okay. So cgi-bin is another special directive within the Apache config, and you might have seen it when I was scrolling through the config before. I'm not going to go hunt it down for you, but basically, cgi-bin is it's getting more antiquated, but there are still use cases for it. What it's for is executable content that you want the web browser to be able to parse and send back to you. Or I shouldn't say the web browser. You want the server to be able to parse and serve the result back to the web browser. It's in its own directory. I think that was always done for security reasons, but I'm really not sure why it always ended up in its own directory, because common web applications that use PHP, Python, all those other things, they don't even care about cgi-bin anymore. They just run right inside of your web root. So is there any history there, Scott, that I'm not aware of? I don't really know.
Yeah, so especially it was explicitly so that you could change the access. So when you looked in your http.conf earlier, there was a directory tag where you could set
Yeah,
permissions and stuff. You could do that differently for CGI-bin. You
right,
also allow it to execute things from CGI-bin. There was a control that would allow someone to execute stuff, which you could
right.
not on your other content. And then for us specifically, the reason we still use it is take a look at the SE Linux context on it, Nate. So we can set explicit context to make sure that it is HTTP syscript exec-t type, so that you can
Right,
execute from it, but you can't execute things from other places.
right. All right, so I've made a file here. Let's reset this here a bit. Date.sh. All it does is run. Oh, it did the thing. I have to fix this here because I had it inside of backticks. It just executed it in my when I was dumping it in. So luckily, this is a simple one. All right, so it just echoes the output of date. But what's this stuff above it there? This content type text plain, and then the bare line. That's actually telling your web browser what type of content it should parse this as. This your browser will treat this as plain text. You could say text HTML, and then if this outputted actual HTML code, it would parse it as HTML and it would format it, right? So just a thing to keep aware of. If you don't put that in there, you'll get an internal server error when you try to load this thing. And then you'll be like, why doesn't my script work? It works at the terminal. Why doesn't it work through Apache? Well, that's why, because you didn't put the content type in there. All right, so I think that's it. We have the thing in place. I did the restore con. We should, now I went and closed that browser tab. Got to reopen it.
So while you're doing that, Shantanu has a couple of other quick tips. One is he disagrees with use of backticks, which I also disagree with, and
Yeah,
said,
you can use the variable thing. Yeah.
and the reason for that is that backticks are not easily accessible in every keyboard layout. So for our international friends who might use a different keyboard layout, backtick can be hard to find or access, but dollar parenthesis is usually easier.
Okay.
And then the other suggestion was redirecting standard error to a log file so that you can still capture it.
Again, super simple demonstration, but yes, there's lots of things you can do to make sure that you can get better error reporting out of this. All right. One more time, I had to switch back to my browser tab. You'll see my privacy error once that comes up on the screen. This is, again, because I didn't want you to think I was doing anything fancy. Got to type in I had a typo in the URL. If I hit enter now, you should, oh, it's an internal server error anyway. What did I forget? I think I forgot to make it executable. Let me try it again.
So you could actually,
There
the
we go.
internal server error is a terrible error message because it basically
Yes, it
is
is.
the browser, something happened. But if we actually looked in the error log, there would be a more exact reason for that. And that's where you want to go when you see that internal server error.
Yep. So you can see here that it is working. I know that's probably really tiny and hard to read. There you go. But it in fact is showing the date in UTC from the server that it ran on. That is not the date on my local machine. That is, I promise you, the date coming from the web server. So there you go. That's how cgi-bin works. And you can get crazy complicated with this stuff. You can include this in HTML using like server-side includes. You can call it from other applications. Like there's all kinds of fun things you can do here. I've used this in like capture the flag contests to pull in dynamic codes and stuff. It's like that's really the only use I've had for it in the past decade or so. All right, man, that is that. I feel like we have to cover something else, Scott, because we're on time.
Well, we are going to cover something else, just not today.
Yeah. Okay.
So we can talk about what's coming up. So next week, unfortunately, Nate and I are both at a conference. However, unlike most weeks where Nate and I are doing other things and we just don't have a show, we will still have a show. By who, you might ask? Well, it's going to be Clone Force 99. Eric and Brian Smith are going to guest host our show and do some terrible things, I am sure.
So
But
it's
they'll
a
test.
RHEL presents takeover of Into the Terminal. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, geez, I didn't think about it like that. That's man.
What
So
could go wrong?
the Bad Batch will be here doing bad.
Wait, it includes Brian Smith. They're going to talk about system roles or cockpit. It has to be, right? Oh man, it's producer Eric.
So next week, guest hosts. They're actually going to be talking about GNOME tips, and it'll be interesting. You'll get a different viewpoint because it won't be me or Nate.
All I got to say is it better be GNOME terminal, because this is into the terminal, not into the desktop interface.
So the week after that, Nate and I will be back, and we are going to go deeper into services. We're going to revisit this, but instead we're going to deploy a more complex application. Right, Nate?
Yeah. So, well, there's also episode 100 in there, though, Scott. Is that before or after we do our next service?
You're right. We have episode 100. Man.
Yeah. Scott's off today. So episode 100 of Into the Terminal is coming up. And we're not 100% certain what that's going to look like, but it's going to be different and it's going to be fun.
And then we'll get back into services.
Then we're going to go into then it'll be we're going to extend a little bit into what we just talked about today by taking an actual dynamic application, probably something like WordPress, but we haven't quite decided exactly what it's going to be yet, and show you how to deploy that on RHEL instead of just simple basic HTML.
So good on us, Nate, for having a plan for the next few weeks. High five.
I know. We have like almost a month of content planned.
So also coming up in 2 weeks, RHEL Presents will do their own show after we kick them off of our show, and they'll be covering Stratus. Stratus is a storage pooling technology that will allow you to tie storage from multiple different devices into a single allocatable storage pool. So if you're curious about Stratus, 2 weeks, RHEL Presents, it's Wednesdays. And I think that's what we got coming up.
I think you're right. I think that's everything. This has been fun. I hope you guys learned something about Apache today. And if you didn't learn something, I hope you got a good laugh out of my typos or Clumsy Bird or something.
So don't forget to hit that like button, and we will see you in a couple weeks. Bad Batch will be here next week to cover GNOME tips. See you, everyone.
Have a great one.